When my son walked through the door that Sunday afternoon, hand in hand with a young woman, I thought my heart was going to stop. Not because she wasn't beautiful, she was, but because behind her smile, I saw the ghost of a past I've spent 20 years trying to forget. That moment was quiet, but in my chest, something cracked open. I remember the sound of their laughter as they entered. Light, hopeful, innocent. Daniel's deep chuckle, the same one he had as a boy when he'd run barefoot through our yard, calling out for me to see the frogs he'd caught. And beside him, her Maya. Her presence filled the house before she even spoke. She looked around my living room with curiosity, eyes tracing the framed family photos, the floral curtains, the old upright piano that hadn't been played since my husband died. When her gaze finally landed on me, she smiled warmly. "Mrs. Jenkins," she said softly, extending her hand. "It's so nice to finally meet you." Her voice was gentle, polite, practiced, like someone who'd been raised to charm. I shook her hand and smiled back, though my mind was still racing, trying to make sense of what my eyes were whispering to me. I've seen that face before. Not hers exactly, but something in her expression, the tilt of her head, the confidence behind her sweetness. It reminded me of someone I used to know too well, but I told myself I was being foolish. I hadn't met many of Daniel's girlfriends before. He'd always been private that way, and it wasn't fair to project my ghosts onto this young woman. So I tucked the thought away, smoothed my blouse, and offered them tea. We sat in the living room while the afternoon sun poured through the lace curtains, painting everything gold. Maya spoke about her job at an interior design firm, about how she and Daniel had met at a charity gala, how she loved the smell of cinnamon and rain. She was warm, articulate, and clearly smitten. Daniel watched her like she hung the moon. I hadn't seen that kind of light in his eyes since he was a teenager, building his first wooden model airplane with his father in the garage. He reached for her hand. "Mom," he said, "Maya's the one. We're getting married." I felt my throat tighten. I smiled because that's what mothers do, but inside, something began to hum, low and uneasy, a sound only I could hear. That night, after they left, I sat at the kitchen table long after the dishes were done. The tea had gone cold, and the only sound was the ticking of the wall clock above the sink. My mind replayed the afternoon like an old film reel. Maya's laughter, her poised way of speaking, the small diamond ring catching the light. There was something about her name that scratched at the edges of my memory. Maya. Her father's name had come up in passing, Robert Langston. When Daniel said it, I remember the way my fingers froze midair, the way the spoon clinked too loudly against my cup. Robert Langston. That name was a wound. Even after all these years, I hadn't heard it spoken in this house since my husband, David, passed away, and for good reason, because Robert Langston wasn't just a name from the past. He was the man who had taken everything from us. Before it all fell apart, life had been simple, almost beautiful. David and I built our small company from scratch. We sold handcrafted wooden furniture, the kind that felt like it had a soul. He handled design and production, and I ran the books and managed the store. We worked long hours, but every piece we sold carried a piece of us, and Robert Langston had been our partner. He came into the business like a promise, sharp suits, easy charm, and a handshake that felt like trust. David believed in him, said Robert had the marketing skills and connections they needed to grow beyond our small town. For a while, it worked. Sales tripled. The business expanded into new cities. Then one day, I came home to find David sitting at the table, pale and shaking, a single envelope in his hands. Robert had emptied the accounts, filed for ownership under his own name, sold off the inventory. We lost everything in a week. The house, we managed to save, but the business, the dream we built together was gone. David never recovered. He spent years trying to rebuild, working odd jobs until his health failed. When he passed, I buried more than a husband. I buried the future we'd dreamed of. So when I heard that name again, Robert Langston, my heart felt like it was being squeezed by invisible hands. I told myself it couldn't be the same man. Langston wasn't an uncommon name, and what were the odds that my son would fall in love with his daughter? But that night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling while the moonlight shifted across the room, my mind refusing to rest, because deep down, I already knew. The next morning, Daniel called. His voice was full of excitement, bright and unguarded. "Mom, Maya's parents want to meet you. We're planning a dinner next week at their place." My stomach twisted. "Oh," I said softly. That's lovely, sweetheart. He didn't notice the pause in my voice. He never did when he was this happy. After we hung up, I sat there for a long time, just breathing. The kettle hissed on the stove, the same way it did the night David told me Robert had betrayed him. Only this time, I wasn't just a wife, I was a mother, and my son was about to marry into the family that destroyed ours. The day of the dinner arrived sooner than I wanted. Morning crept in slow and golden, spilling through the curtains like it had no idea what it was walking into. I woke before dawn, sat at the edge of my bed, and watched the light climb up the wall. For the first time in years, I found myself wishing David were still here, not for comfort, but for guidance. He'd always known what to say when I didn't. By late afternoon, I'd ironed my blouse 3 times, changed my earrings twice, and still didn't feel ready. Daniel arrived to pick me up, his smile easy and his excitement infectious. "Mom, you're going to love them," he said as he helped me into the car. "Maya's parents are great people." I smiled back, small and brittle. "I'm sure they are." The drive was quiet, the hum of the tires filling the silence between us. I watched the world blur past the window, the trees bending in the breeze, the evening sky dipping into amber. Everything looked calm. Too calm. When we pulled into the Langstons' neighborhood, my chest grew tight. The houses were large and polished, with manicured lawns and winding driveways. Their home stood near the end of a cul-de-sac, white pillars and tall windows gleaming in the fading light. It was the kind of house success built, or, in some cases, stole. Maya opened the door before we could knock. She looked radiant in a soft blue dress, her smile effortless, her eyes full of light. "You made it," she said, hugging Daniel first, then me. Her perfume lingered, something floral, expensive, familiar. She led us inside. The air smelled faintly of rosemary and roasted garlic. Jazz played low from a speaker in the corner. Everything was curated, not just clean, but intentional. A wall of family photos lined the hallway, smiling faces, vacations, graduations, and then, as my gaze swept over them, I froze. There he was, Robert Langston, older, grayer, heavier around the middle, but unmistakable. The same confident jawline, the same self-assured eyes. In the photo, he stood beside a younger Maya, his hand resting proudly on her shoulder. They both smiled at the camera, unaware that years later, that image would feel like a knife turning inside me. My pulse thudded in my ears. Maya's voice drifted from the kitchen. "Dad, they're here." I wanted to turn and leave, just walk out, claim illness, anything, but I didn't. I straightened my back, smoothed my blouse, and stayed rooted where I was. When he appeared, it felt like time folded in on itself. "Mrs. Jenkins," he said, extending a hand. "It's been a long time." His tone was steady, polite, too polite. I looked at him for a long moment before taking his hand. "Yes," I said softly. "It has." He held my gaze just long enough to let me know he remembered. Then, with the ease of a practiced host, he gestured toward the dining room. "Let's eat. We've got a lot to celebrate." Dinner was normal. To normal. To normal. There was laughter, clinking glasses, polite conversation about travel and wedding plans. Maya's mother, Elaine, was gracious, the kind of woman who made everyone feel comfortable. She asked about my work, complimented my dress, and talked about flower arrangements. All the while, Robert sat across from me, smiling as if he hadn't torn my life apart decades ago. His voice was smooth, his charm intact. He talked about his business, his golf game, his daughter's upcoming promotion. He never once mentioned the company he stole, or the man who died trying to rebuild it. I barely tasted my food. Every word he spoke felt like salt in an old wound, but I couldn't let Daniel see it. He was radiant, talking about his new life with Maya, laughing with her father, oblivious to the silent war happening beneath the table. I stole glances at him, my son, and wondered if he'd ever forgive me if I told him the truth. After dinner, while Maya and Daniel went to the backyard to look at the garden lights, I excused myself to the restroom. I needed air. I found myself wandering down the hall again, drawn back to that wall of photos. This time, I studied them closer. There were pictures from company events, awards, smiling employees, and then tucked among them, one familiar photo nearly made me gasp. It was from a trade show booth. On the banner behind them, Langston & Co., fine furnishings. But I knew, that design, that logo, those carved initials had been David's. Our logo. Our work, still there. Still my fingers trembled as I touched the frame. The name may have changed, but the craftsmanship was unmistakable. Robert hadn't just taken our money. He had taken our legacy. My throat tightened, but I swallowed hard. I couldn't fall apart here, not in front of him, not in front of her. When I returned to the table, Robert met my eyes briefly. His smile had faded. For the first time that evening, he looked uneasy, like he could tell I'd seen too much. As we said our goodbyes, he walked me to the door. The night air was cool, heavy with the scent of pine. He waited until Daniel and Maya were a few steps ahead, then lowered his voice. I never wanted things to happen the way they did, he said quietly. But life moves on, doesn't it? I stared at him. Some people move on, I said. Others are buried under what's left. He hesitated, then gave that same smile, the one that used to fool David. For your son's sake, he murmured. Let's leave the past where it belongs. I said nothing. I simply stepped past him, my heart pounding, and walked toward Daniel's car. As we drove home, Daniel hummed softly to the radio, lost in thought. I sat beside him, staring out the window, my reflection ghostly in the glass. Robert Langston's words echoed in my mind, for your son's sake. But something inside me whispered back, for my husband's sake. I can't. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling while the shadows from the trees danced across the walls. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Robert Langston's face, older, smug, untouchable, and behind it, David's kind, tired, defeated. I hadn't thought about those days in years, not like this. After David's death, I did what I had to do, sold what was left of the business, paid off debts, and built a smaller life. I told myself that survival was its own kind of revenge. But now, with Robert's daughter marrying my son, it felt like the past had clawed its way back into the light. I couldn't just sit still, not when that man's name was about to become my family's. The next morning, I found the old storage boxes in the attic, dust-coated, their corners frayed. Inside were years of paperwork, contracts, letters, photographs. I hadn't opened them since the funeral. My hands trembled as I sifted through invoices and partnership records, searching for something, anything that might explain how Robert took everything from us. And then I found it, a folder labeled Langston Deal Pending Review. Inside were drafts of an unfinished contract, one that David had never signed. It outlined a merger that would have split ownership 50-50, except the version Robert filed later had David's signature forged at the bottom. The ink had bled a little over the years, but it was still clear enough to read, clear enough to remember the day David came home pale and silent, saying only that Robert changed the terms. My heart sank. I pressed my palm to the paper, feeling the weight of years collapse into one moment. Robert hadn't just betrayed a partner, he'd stolen his life's work. That night, when Daniel called to ask if I'd enjoyed dinner, I lied. It was lovely, I said softly. You've chosen a wonderful family. My voice didn't even shake. Over the next few days, I watched from a quiet distance. Maya came by often, bringing wedding magazines, talking about colors and venues. She was sweet, genuinely so. The kind of girl any mother would want for her son. But every time she mentioned her father, I felt my stomach twist. One afternoon, while she sat in my living room flipping through floral arrangements, I asked gently, "Your father? He's still in business, isn't he?" She nodded. "Yes. He runs Langston & Co. He's semi-retired now, but still very involved." "Why?" I smiled faintly. "Just curious. My husband used to work in that industry." Her eyes lit up. "Oh really? Maybe they knew each other." I swallowed hard. "Maybe." She went back to her magazine, humming softly. And that's when I knew. She had no idea who I was. No idea that her father had destroyed my family. That realization hurt more than I expected. Not just because of what he'd done, but because of what she represented. Innocence built on someone else's ruin. I excused myself and went to the kitchen under the pretense of making tea. But as the kettle boiled, I pulled out my phone and searched Langston & Co. Their website was immaculate, sleek design, polished mission statement, decades of family-run excellence. There was even a section called Our History. I clicked, and there it was. A timeline filled with lies. It credited Robert Langston as the sole founder, highlighting his visionary craftsmanship and independent rise from humble beginnings. Not a single mention of David Jenkins. Not one. I scrolled faster, my pulse racing. Every design, every product photo, I recognized them. The carved oak lines, the trademark curves, the same patterns David had drawn by hand in our garage, and at the bottom, beneath a smiling photo of Robert and Maya at an award ceremony, was a quote, "Legacy is about what we build for those we love." I dropped the phone on the counter. The sound echoed through the kitchen like a gunshot. For a long time, I just stood there, the whistle of the kettle piercing the silence, steam curling in the air. That night, I couldn't eat, couldn't think. All I could see was that quote, "Legacy is about what we build for those we love." David had built that legacy, and Robert had stolen it to hand to his daughter, the same daughter who would soon become my daughter-in-law. A week later, Daniel called to say they'd set a date. "We're thinking early spring, Mom. Dad's old workshop would be a great place for the photos, don't you think? It's rustic, kind of poetic." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The workshop, the last piece of David's world, was still there. A few miles outside town. It had been closed for years, but I'd never sold it. Daniel must have remembered how happy his father had been there. "That's thoughtful," I managed to say. After we hung up, I sat for a long time in silence, staring at the old photograph. On my mantel, David, smiling in that same workshop, sawdust in his hair, hands rough but proud. I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I drove to the workshop. The air inside was thick with dust and memory. Tools hung untouched on the walls, their metal dulled by time. The wooden workbench still bore faint stains, varnish, glue, maybe even tears. I ran my fingers over the carvings, feeling each groove. And there, in the corner, I found the old company ledger, handwritten, meticulous. It listed every sale, every client, every shipment. The last page stopped me cold. It detailed a large transfer, a full shipment of handcrafted dining sets, marked paid in full by Langston & Co. The date was 2 weeks before David's collapse, and scribbled beneath, in David's handwriting, "Robert says final payment coming soon. Pray he keeps his word." He never did. I sank into the old stool, the weight of it all pressing down on me. Robert hadn't just stolen the business, he'd broken the man who trusted him most, and now, my son was about to marry into that man's family. I sat there until sunset, the light falling across the floorboards in long golden streaks. Somewhere, outside, birds called to one another, unaware of the storm building inside me. By the time I stood, my decision was clear. I wasn't going to destroy Daniel's happiness out of spite. But I also wasn't going to let Robert Langston's name sit beside mine at the wedding altar, not without the truth being known. The drive home from the workshop felt endless. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that the veins stood out blue against my skin. I wasn't sure what burned stronger, the grief of old memories or the new, bitter fire of injustice. That night, I didn't cry. I'd done enough of that years ago. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table with the old ledger open beside my tea, and I began to make notes, quietly, deliberately, the way David used to when he was designing something important. I wasn't sure what I was building yet, but I knew this much. If Robert Langston wanted to walk into my life again, I'd make sure he tripped over every lie he'd ever told. The first step was small, a quiet email. I reached out to a retired accountant who had worked with David during the early years. Her name was June, a sharp-minded woman with a soft voice. We hadn't spoken since the funeral. When I explained what I'd found, there was a long pause on the line. Then she said quietly, "I always wondered about that merger, Helen. Robert's numbers never added up. But your husband, he trusted people." She promised to look through her old records, just in case. 2 days later, a package arrived, thin, wrapped in brown paper. Inside were photocopies of transaction sheets and letters. On the top was a note in June's neat handwriting. "You were right. He forged more than one signature." I sat there, staring at those papers, the room spinning slightly. The evidence was all their false signatures, altered invoices, even a letter addressed to a lawyer that Robert must have intercepted. Every document told the same story. David's company had been stolen piece by piece, until nothing was left. I thought of my son, of how proud he'd been to tell me about his new in-laws, about how Maya's father was so kind, so successful. It made me sick. I knew I couldn't confront Robert directly, not yet. I had to be careful. For all his charm, he was still a man who knew how to bury truth under expensive lawyers and polite smiles. So I waited. I played the part of the supportive mother, smiling through dress fittings and venue visits, all while quietly gathering everything I could. but the more I saw Robert, the harder it became to keep my mask steady. At one family dinner, he reached across the table to refill my glass, saying with that same false humility, "I'm so grateful our families are coming together. Helen, Daniel, is a fine young man." I forced a smile. "He takes after his father." Robert's eyes flickered just for a second, as if the name alone stirred something old and inconvenient. Then he said smoothly, "Ah yes, David. He was in the trade, wasn't he?" "In the trade," I repeated softly, setting down my fork. "You could say that he built things, honest things." The table fell quiet. Maya, oblivious, reached for the salad bowl and asked about the wedding cake. I answered her gently, but my gaze never left Robert. He looked away first. A week later, the engagement party arrived, a lavish event at a rented hall, filled with crystal chandeliers and gold-trimmed linens. Everyone was dressed to impress. I wore navy silk, the same color as the sky before a storm. When I walked in, I saw him immediately. Robert stood by the bar, laughing too loudly, surrounded by guests who hung on his every word. I could feel my pulse in my throat. Daniel and Maya were radiant, greeting people, completely unaware of the undercurrent between us. I had the papers in my purse, copies of everything June had sent. I didn't plan to use them that night, but I wanted them close, like a reminder of why I was standing there at all. As the evening went on, people toasted, music played, and Robert eventually made his way to me. "Helen," he said smoothly, holding out a hand, "you look lovely tonight. It's been far too long since I've seen you smile." I looked at his hand, then back at him. "I suppose some smiles take years to come back." He chuckled, pretending not to notice the edge in my voice. "Well, I'm glad to see one tonight, for our children's sake." "Our children," I repeated quietly. Funny how life brings things full circle. He nodded, sipping his drink. "Yes, it does. Sometimes I think the past, it was all meant to lead us here." The audacity of that nearly took my breath away, but I didn't respond. I just gave him a long, steady look, the kind that said I remembered everything. He held my gaze for a moment, then looked away first. His laugh returned, a little too forced this time. The next morning, I knew it was time, to humiliate him, but to make sure the truth couldn't stay buried. I contacted a local journalist who had written an anniversary feature about David's company years ago. She still remembered the story, and she remembered me. When I told her what I'd found, she asked if I had proof. "I have enough to make a man choke," I said quietly. We met at a cafe on the edge of town. I handed her the folder and explained everything, the contracts, the forged documents, the lies. She listened in silence, her pen moving steadily. When we were done, she said, "If I can verify this, Helen, people are going to know the truth." "That's all I ever wanted," I replied. The truth. It wasn't revenge, I felt. Not really. It was something quieter, like balance being restored. 2 weeks passed. I heard nothing. Then, on a Sunday morning, I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing nonstop. There it was, front page of the local business section. Forgery scandal rocks, Langston and CO. I read the article 3 times before I fully absorbed it. The journalist had been thorough, every detail laid out, every document authenticated. Robert's reputation, his company, his legacy, all laid bare. My phone rang again. "Daniel, Mom," he said breathlessly. "Have you seen the news? Maya's father, they're saying I've seen it," I said quietly. He was silent for a long moment. "Did you?" "No." My throat tightened. I knew enough to let the truth come out. He didn't speak again, just a soft, shaky exhale. And in that silence, I knew what would come next. Anger, confusion, hurt, but also, maybe one day, understanding. That night, as the sun dipped low and the house filled with the orange glow of dusk, I took out the old ledger one last time. I traced David's handwriting with my fingertips, whispering, "It's over now." The next chapter of our lives was about to begin for me, for Daniel, and even for Maya, who was now caught in a storm she never created. But the truth had finally spoken, and I was ready to face whatever came after. The news of what happened at the dinner didn't stay quiet for long. By morning, whispers had already begun, in the family group chat, in my husband's old business circle, even among the wedding planners. People always talk, especially when money and pride are involved, but I wasn't ready for the way it spread, like wildfire through dry grass. That it started with a call from an old family friend, "Mr. Abbas Mariam," he said, voice low and heavy with concern. "Is it true what they're saying? That Fahad exposed his future I paused. the air thick in my throat. I don't know what they're saying, I replied carefully. He sighed. Then, I'll tell you, they say the man's been running fraudulent contracts under your husband's old company name, that there are investigations starting. My knees almost gave way. Not because of guilt, but because this truth, which had poisoned our home for years, was finally crawling out into the light. I didn't tell Fahad right away. He was already carrying too much. His engagement was hanging by a thread. A week had passed since the dinner, and Aisha hadn't come by once. Her calls were short, strained. When she did speak, she sounded like she was trapped between two fires. "Ami, please," she said once, almost in tears. "My father is saying things that aren't true. He swears your husband cheated him first." I didn't argue. I'd lived that pain long enough to know that truth bends differently depending on who's holding it. But that night, I sat with Fahad. He was sitting by the window, laptop open, the light from the screen turning his face pale. "Ami," he said softly, "you were right. The contracts, they're fake." I looked through the old company records. He used Dad's signature, a digital copy. That's why he didn't want me to meet his team. I closed my eyes, fighting back tears. "So what will you do, Beta?" He took a deep breath. "I'll report it quietly. I won't make a scene." For a moment, pride and sorrow collided inside me. My son, the boy who used to cry over a broken toy, now making decisions that could tear families apart. 2 days later, the first article appeared online. Businessmen under investigation for financial misconduct. No names were mentioned, but we knew. Everyone who needed to know knew. Aisha's father disappeared from social circles. Clients withdrew. His company, once a proud name on every billboard, began to crumble. And yet, through it all, I couldn't bring myself to feel joy. Fahad avoided the topic. He went to work, came home late, and ate dinner in silence. His phone would buzz occasionally, Aisha's name lighting the screen, but he'd stare at it until it stopped ringing. One evening, as I was watering the plants, I saw a car pull up outside. Aisha stepped out. She looked different, smaller somehow. No makeup, no jewelry, just a white kurta and tired eyes. She walked up to me, her hands trembling. "Auntie," she said quietly, "may I come in?" I nodded, moving aside. We sat at the dining table where so many memories had been made and broken. "I didn't know," she said, voice shaking. "I swear to you, I didn't know what my father had done. When the truth came out, he blamed me for choosing your family. He said I betrayed him." Her words hung heavy in the air. I reached across the table and held her hand. "You are not your father," I whispered. "You don't have to carry his sins." Tears filled her eyes. "But Fahad, he's hurting," I interrupted softly. "Not just because of what your father did, but because he feels torn. Give him time." She nodded, wiping her eyes. "I will." When Fahad came home later that evening, he stopped in the doorway, stunned to see her. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then, finally, Aisha stood and walked toward him. "I didn't come to defend my father," she said. "I came to tell you I understand why you did what you did." Fahad's expression softened, the anger in his eyes melting into exhaustion. "I never wanted to hurt you," he whispered. "I know." She smiled faintly. "But sometimes the truth hurts everyone, even the ones who didn't cause it." It was a quiet reconciliation, not a fairy tale one. They didn't rush back into wedding plans. They didn't make promises. They just stood there, understanding that love, when tested by truth, either deepens or dies. And in that silence, I felt something inside me settle. Not peace, not yet, but the beginning of it. Over the next few months, things changed slowly. The investigation deepened. Aisha's father faced legal action. The community that once admired him grew distant. My husband, though gone, seemed present in every moment of justice that unfolded. One morning, Fahad placed an old photograph on my table, the one of him sitting on his father's shoulders, grinning. Years ago, he would have been proud, wouldn't he? I looked at my son and smiled through my tears. He already is. It's outside. The winter sun broke through the clouds, soft, forgiving, warm, for the first time in years. I opened the windows wide and let the air in, because no matter how broken the truth had left us, at least now, it was ours.